had always liked camping alone. There was a quiet freedom to it, a rhythm to being completely on my own in the forest that made me feel alive in a way that city life never did. I had been on a few trips in my life, mostly short weekends at nearby parks, easy trails, and well-marked paths. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted real isolation. I wanted to be somewhere I had to think about every step, every sound, every rustle of leaves. So, after weeks of planning, I drove 6 hours to a remote national forest I had never visited before, one with no cell service and only a single trail map that I had carefully photocopied. I arrived mid-afternoon, the sun already low enough to cast long shadows through the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, sharp and almost sweet. The trailhead was narrow, marked only by a small, weathered wooden sign. There were no other cars, no other people, just the forest and me. I carried my backpack with me as I started the trail, which quickly narrowed into a rough path littered with roots and rocks. The forest felt older here, wilder, as though it had never been touched by humans beyond this single trail. I walked for hours, slowing down to look at small details. A squirrel darting across the path, a bird perched on a branch, a cluster of mushrooms at the base of a tree. I took note of the direction of the sun and my compass to make sure I didn't wander too far off course. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a creek, a flat space that seemed perfect for my tent. The sound of running water was soft but steady, and it felt comforting, a small lifeline in the otherwise quiet forest. I set up my tent slowly, methodically. I made sure the pegs were secure, the rainfly was tight, and my sleeping bag was dry. I stacked firewood in a small pile near a flat rock that I would use as a hearth. As evening came, I built a fire. There was something almost ceremonial about it. Arranging the logs, striking the match, watching the flames catch and grow. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the trees around me, and for a moment, I felt a thrill of contentment and accomplishment. I ate a small meal of canned beans and bread, washed down with water from my filter. I cleaned my cooking area carefully, aware that any smell could attract wildlife. Everything felt normal, calm, secure. But as night fell completely, the forest changed. The air cooled rapidly, the darkness pressing in like a weight. I lay in my tent for a while, listening. The creek burbled in the distance. Somewhere far off, an animal cried out. A sharp, high-pitched sound that made me tense. I reminded myself it was probably a fox or some nocturnal bird. I rolled over, tried to get comfortable, and finally drifted into a light sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch falling, but then I realized it was closer. Something stepping carefully but deliberately through the underbrush. My heart started to pound. I stayed still, straining my ears. There was a rustling sound, slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. Whoever or whatever was out there seemed to be circling, listening, watching. I reached slowly for my flashlight, careful not to make noise. I clicked it on and peered outside the tent. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating trees, bushes, and the faint outline of the creek, but there was nothing immediately visible. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, and that rational thinking would keep me calm. But the noise came again. Footsteps, slow and soft, stopping and starting. Not fast like a running animal, slow and heavy. I froze, holding my breath. I remembered the knife in my pack and unzipped the tent slowly, keeping low. I turned on the flashlight and swept it in a wide arc. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched behind a tree, a man watching me. His movements were deliberate, careful, and he was close enough that I could see the outline of his face in the dim moonlight. My stomach dropped, and my mind raced. I had thought about encountering wildlife, maybe getting lost, but never this. Never another human, a stranger, at night in the middle of the forest. I retreated quickly back into the tent, zipping it closed and grabbing my backpack. I had packed everything I would need to hike out: food, water, flashlight, first aid kit. My plan formed instantly: leave. I didn't care about the tent, the fire, or the supplies. I just needed to get out. I listened for movement, but it was silent now. Maybe he had left, maybe he was waiting. I didn't take any chances. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, and headed toward the trail. The forest was pitch dark, except for the small cone of light ahead of me. My boots crunched over leaves and twigs. Every sound made me flinch. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the shadows. The trail was narrow, twisting, and covered with roots and rocks. I stumbled more than once, scraping my hands and knees on rough bark and stones. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, I heard a sound that froze me. The snap of a branch close behind me. I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, but again there was nothing. My breath came in ragged gasps. I ran. Every step was careful and deliberate at first, then faster as adrenaline surged through me. I had memorized the trail on the map, but darkness made everything confusing. Every tree looked the same, every shadow a potential threat. Then I tripped hard over a root and fell forward. My flashlight skittered across the ground, landing at an angle that lit up a path I hadn't noticed before. A faint deer trail leading slightly downhill. I hesitated, my knee scraped and bleeding, my hands dirty and torn. But staying on the main trail seemed dangerous. I decided to follow the deer trail, hoping it would lead to a larger path or road. The trail twisted steeply down, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on wet roots and rocks. The creek I had camped by was somewhere above me, the sound of running water faint but constant. My mind kept flashing images of the man, crouched and watching, waiting for me to slip or look back. I told myself I couldn't stop thinking about that now. I needed to focus. I needed to get to safety. Hours passed, though I had no real way of knowing. My flashlight was dimming. My legs ached. My hands were raw. The forest seemed endless, and every shadow, every movement made my heart jump. But gradually, the terrain began to level out. I came to another small creek, wider and shallower than the first. I recognized it from the map. I was near a secondary trail that led to a Forest Service road. Relief and exhaustion collided. I followed the secondary trail, slower now, careful not to injure myself further. Dawn was breaking, the sky pale gray, and with it came a strange sense of hope. Birds began to chirp in the distance, and the forest seemed less menacing, though still vast and wild. By mid-morning, I reached the Forest Service road. It was gravel, abandoned, but unmistakable. I collapsed against a tree, bleeding, sore, but alive. I had made it out. Eventually, a passing car spotted me and took me to the nearest town. I got medical attention for minor cuts and dehydration, and I told the authorities about the man in the forest. They searched the area for days but never found him. I never went back to that trail, never went back to that forest. But I kept thinking about that night, about the quiet footsteps, the way he had watched me. The experience changed how I approached camping forever. I still loved being in the wilderness, but I never went alone again. I always told someone my plan, carried extra supplies, and kept an escape route in mind. And though it was terrifying, I survived. I kept every detail in my memory. The smell of the forest at night, the sound of the creek, the weight of fear pressing on me. I knew that being prepared, staying calm, and keeping focused had saved me. Even months later, when I walked in the city or traveled somewhere new, I thought about that night. The memory was vivid, almost tactile, the darkness, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. And though I would never forget it, I also remembered the relief, the first sight of the road, the sunlight breaking through the trees. I survived. I made it. And that, in the end, was a kind of victory I would carry with me forever. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. After the exhaustion of city life, the constant noise and stress, I wanted a place that was completely isolated, far from other people, far from roads, far from anything that reminded me of work, bills, or deadlines. I had studied maps for days, pinpointing a small national forest area that was almost untouched. There were no marked trails in the part one wanted to go to, and satellite images showed thick pine forests, a slow-moving creek, and some rocky outcroppings. I packed my backpack with extra food, a water filter, a tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, knives, flashlight, extra batteries, fire starter, rope, and all the essentials, making sure I had everything I could possibly need. I told no one where I was going, only mentioning vaguely that I was going on a weekend camping trip. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to escape everything. What I didn't realize at the time was how unprepared I was for the kind of real danger that nature could throw at me when you are completely alone and far from anyone who could help. I arrived at the forest edge in the late afternoon, the sun low in the sky. The road ended in a narrow dirt path that quickly vanished into thick trees. I parked my car and hoisted my pack on my shoulders, feeling the weight settle across my back. The first few hours of hiking were easy enough. The forest was dense, but the ground was soft under my boots, covered in pine needles. Birds called occasionally, and a breeze rustled the leaves. I passed old tree stumps, moss-covered rocks, and small patches of wildflowers. Felt untouched, like stepping into another world. I felt exhilarated. I hadn't even set up camp yet, but I already felt the calmness that I had been craving. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near the creek I had seen on the map. The water was shallow and clear, moving slowly over smooth stones. I knelt to drink some, scooping water with my hands after running it through the filter. I set up my tent carefully, securing all the stakes in the soft soil, arranging my sleeping bag and gear inside. The sun was dipping below the treetops, sending golden light through the forest. I built a small fire near the creek, but far enough from my tent to be safe. The smell of burning wood mixed with the earthy scent of the forest, and I felt a deep, calm satisfaction. I cooked a simple meal on the fire, freeze-dried pasta, which didn't taste like much, but it was hot and filling. The first night felt perfect. I sat by the fire as darkness fell, listening to the forest sounds, feeling the warmth of the flames against the cooling air. I didn't feel lonely at all, just small and contained in this vast, wild place. It was around midnight when I first heard something that made my stomach twist. A low, heavy snapping of a branch came from deeper in the forest, far enough that I couldn't see anything, but close enough to make me uneasy. I froze, listening. Another snap, followed by a rustle, like leaves being crushed under weight. My first thought was a deer or maybe a bear moving slowly through the underbrush. But there was no typical animal sound, no rustling of leaves from quick movement, no warning cries. It sounded deliberate, heavy steps, careful but intentional. I stayed as still as I could, holding my flashlight loosely, my eyes adjusting to the firelight flickering on the trees. The sound stopped as if whoever or whatever it was had decided to watch me for a moment. I tried to calm myself. I reminded myself that the forest was full of animals, maybe a raccoon or a fox, and that I was overthinking. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I eventually blew out the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the tent flap partially zipped so I could see outside. I didn't sleep well. Every small crack, every movement of wind through the trees made me tense. Morning came slowly. I could hear birds chirping again, the forest alive with normal sounds. The previous night felt unreal in the daylight. I packed my campsite carefully, leaving no trace behind, and continued my hike further into the forest. The plan was to follow the creek upstream, where the map showed a small rock formation that I wanted to explore. The terrain grew rougher. Roots twisted across the ground, slippery moss covered the rocks, and the creek cut into the earth, creating steep embankments. I had to be careful with every step. I kept thinking about the previous night, the noises, but I tried to push the memory aside. I was alone, yes, but nothing had happened. I was strong, careful, and prepared. Around midday, I reached a particularly narrow section of the creek where rocks jutted into the water, forcing me to step carefully from stone to continue. The water was icy cold, and my boots became slippery as I moved. I was halfway across when I slipped. My foot hit moss and I lost balance. I fell hard, hitting my elbow and scraping my knee against the rough stone. Pain shot up my arm, and I sat in the water for a moment, catching my breath. My backpack had shifted but not fallen in. I checked my injuries, cuts and bruises, nothing broken. I pressed my hand over my elbow and knee to stop minor bleeding, and slowly got back on my feet. That was when I noticed something chilling. Footprints. Large footprints in the soft mud along the bank. They weren't human. They were much bigger, wider, and the tread looked wrong for any boot I knew. I stared at them for a long moment, my heart racing. They led both upstream and downstream like whoever or whatever was there had been moving along the creek recently. And they were fresh, almost as if they had been made in the last hour. I felt a twinge of fear but forced myself to stay calm. Maybe an animal, I thought. Maybe a bear. Bears left large prints, and I had read about this. I checked my pack, bear spray, knife, flashlight. I was ready. I took a deep breath and decided to continue upstream, keeping my eyes on the water and banks. The afternoon dragged. The forest grew denser, the trees older, the underbrush thick. Every step required attention. I kept thinking about the prints, scanning the edges of the creek for movement. The creek wound through rocky terrain, and eventually I reached a small waterfall cascading into a deep pool. It was beautiful. Sunlight shimmered on the water, and I paused to rest, sitting on a flat rock above the pool. The air was cool, filled with the scent of wet stone and pine. I drank some filtered water and checked my supplies. I decided to make this my lunch stop. While eating, I heard the sound again, the low snap of a branch very close. I froze. My pulse raced. This time it wasn't far. Something moved in the underbrush on the opposite bank. I couldn't see clearly, only the vague shape of movement, shadows shifting among the trees. My heart pounded. I knew bears could be dangerous, but this didn't feel like a bear. It felt intelligent. Person? I doubted it. There was no way someone would be out here without a trail, unannounced. I tightened my grip on my knife and looked for an escape route. I couldn't cross the creek back. It was steep, wet, dangerous. The forest behind me looked the same as ahead. I had to keep moving carefully. I finished eating and packed up slowly, moving cautiously. Every step I took, I scanned the edges of the creek. Shadows shifted, leaves rustled. Sometimes I thought I saw a glimpse of something, just enough to make me tense, but when I focused, it was gone. The sun was lowering again, and I realized I was far from anywhere I could camp safely for the night. The only options were to backtrack in the growing darkness or find a small flat spot near the creek. I chose the latter, figuring that a place near water would be safer and that I could make a fire. After an hour of searching, I found a tiny clearing, just big enough for my tent. I set up quickly, moving as quietly as I could. I built a small fire, keeping it low, just enough to light the area around me. Every sound now made me flinch. The creek splashing over rocks, a bird taking off suddenly, leaves rustling in the wind. I kept my knife close, my flashlight charged and ready. Night fell fully, dark and heavy. I sat near the fire, straining to hear anything unusual. The forest seemed alive with normal night sounds. But then, over the background noise, I heard it again. The snapping of a branch. Closer this time. I held my breath, scanning the treeline. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, moving from one tree to another. My fire flickered, casting long shapes on the forest floor. I realized I could hear something moving slowly around the edge of my small clearing, circling. My mind raced. I was completely alone, unarmed except for my knife and bear spray. I considered trying to scare it away, make noise, shout, but I knew that could provoke whatever it was. I stayed perfectly still, keeping the fire between me and the movement, hoping it was a deer or an animal that would eventually leave. Hours passed like this. Every snap, every crack made me tense. I barely slept, dozing in short bursts, my ears straining. At first light, I noticed signs around my camp. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, and large footprints surrounding my tent. Whatever had been circling me had been close enough that I might have been attacked if I had moved suddenly. My heart sank. I realized I had to leave immediately. I packed quickly, moving cautiously, checking behind me constantly. I retraced my steps along the creek, trying to follow the path I had come from. The forest seemed different in the light, less menacing, but the prints were still there, following the edge of the creek. I kept moving, not daring to stop, not daring to look back too long. Hours passed. By midday, I reached the wider path I had used the first day. Relief washed over me. I was near the edge of the forest. As I emerged from the trees, I finally felt safe enough to run, my legs pumping, backpack bouncing on my shoulders. I reached my car, unlocked it, and sat inside, breathing heavily. My hands shook. I checked the area briefly. No signs of anyone or anything unusual, but I didn't wait to investigate. I drove out of the forest as fast as I could, the road long and winding. Once I reached the first town, I stopped at a gas station, drank water, and finally allowed myself to calm down. I called a friend to let someone know I was okay. The experience haunted me for weeks. I kept thinking about the prints, the circling movement in the night, the deliberate snapping of branches. But it also taught me lessons about preparation, awareness, and survival. I realized that nature is not just beautiful. It can be unforgiving and dangerous in ways you can't predict. I never went back to that part of the forest. I learned to respect the wild more, to understand that even when you are alone, careful, and experienced, you are not invincible. But I also learned that careful planning, awareness, and staying calm in fear can make the difference between safety and disaster. I had survived, fully aware that the forest could have ended my trip, or worse, if I had made a single wrong move. And that knowledge, though terrifying, stayed with me, making every future trip safer, more measured, and more respectful of the quiet, dangerous power of the wilderness. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the noise, the traffic, the constant hum of life that never really stopped, was intoxicating. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of nature that felt raw and untouched. I loaded my old, worn-out backpack with everything I thought I would need. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a small portable stove, food that could last for several days, water purification tablets, and my first aid kit. I packed light but carefully, checking each item off my mental list several times. I had camped before, but never this far into the backcountry, where the trails were rarely traveled, and the few hikers who ventured there did so in small numbers and for short distances. I drove for hours, the city fading behind me until the asphalt road ended, leaving only gravel and dirt paths. The GPS signal grew weak as I turned onto a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into a wall of trees. The forest was dense, a mix of pine and birch, the ground uneven and covered in fallen branches, leaves, and patches of moss. The air felt different the moment I stepped out of the car, cooler, damp, heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. It was a silence that wasn't complete, though. Somewhere in the distance, a stream burbled, and occasionally, a bird or a small animal scuttled in the underbrush, the sound sharp and sudden in the stillness. I started hiking. My backpack felt heavier than I expected, each step requiring careful placement over roots and rocks that jutted out of the earth. The trail was narrow, winding, and in some places almost invisible under layers of fallen leaves. I kept my eyes on the path but couldn't resist glancing around. The forest seemed endless, dark in its depth even though it was early afternoon. I followed the map I had printed at home, cross-referencing landmarks, streams, and small hills. I moved slowly but steadily, knowing that in such areas, a wrong turn could cost hours or worse. After about 3 hours, I came across a small clearing. It was quiet and open, the ground flat enough to pitch a tent. I decided this would be my first night's campsite. I carefully chose a spot away from dead branches that hung over the clearing and far enough from the stream so that any sudden rise in water would not be dangerous. The sun was already starting to dip below the trees, casting long, dark shadows across the forest floor. I pitched my tent with practiced movements, hammering the stakes into the soil and adjusting the lines until the tent stood firm. The process took time, and by the time I finished, the sun was low and the temperature was beginning to drop. I set up my small stove and started boiling water. The hiss of the flame and the bubbling of water were oddly comforting sounds after hours of silence. I had brought dehydrated meals, simple food that didn't require much preparation, but even that felt luxurious in this setting. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth and the fact that I was alone in a place where human presence felt minimal. After cleaning up, I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to rest. The first night in the backcountry was always the hardest. Every small noise, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I told myself these were harmless animals, nothing dangerous. Still, sleep came in fits and starts, fragmented by imagined sounds that my brain insisted on interpreting as threats. Morning arrived, mist hanging low over the forest, the air wet and cold. I broke camp quickly, packed my tent, and started moving again. My goal was to reach a larger river several miles ahead, a place where I could refill water and rest more securely. The hike was harder than I expected. The forest floor was slippery from dew, the path sometimes disappearing entirely under dense undergrowth. I had to climb over fallen logs, push through brambles, and carefully navigate moss-covered rocks that could have sent me tumbling if I lost my footing. My legs ached, my back protested from the heavy pack, but the thought of setting up camp again after a long day kept me going. Around midday, I finally reached the river. It was wider than I had imagined, flowing swiftly with a dark, churning current. The water was clear enough to see smooth stones at the bottom, and I immediately set up my water purification system. I had brought both a small filter and purification tablets, and I treated several liters before drinking. My energy returned somewhat after the water and a quick snack. I searched along the riverbank for a suitable campsite. There was a small flat area just above the high water mark. I cleared rocks and sticks, dug a small fire pit, and set up my tent. By late afternoon, the sun was low, and the forest around me was bathed in an orange glow. I started a fire, collecting dry branches and kindling, which was not easy near the river because the ground was damp. After several attempts, I managed a small, steady flame. I cooked a simple meal and watched the fire, feeling a sense of satisfaction and relief. Night would be colder here, and the forest seemed even darker and denser than the previous night. I double-checked that all my food was secured in my pack and hung from a tree branch a few meters away from the tent, just in case any curious animals were nearby. That night, I slept lighter than before. The sounds of the river were constant, but other noises began to creep in. The rustling of undergrowth, faint snapping twigs, and the occasional guttural sound that I couldn't immediately identify. My mind kept running through possibilities. A deer moving through the brush, a raccoon scavenging for food, maybe even a coyote. But some sounds felt wrong, closer, deliberate. My heart raced whenever I heard them. I would lie still, listening, staring into the darkness of the tent, imagining shapes moving just beyond the fabric walls. Every sudden noise made me tense, my hands reaching for the small pocket knife I always kept within reach. By the third day, I had become more cautious. I moved more slowly, checking the path ahead carefully. The forest was growing denser, and I was beginning to feel the isolation more intensely. No one else was around, and the trails I followed seemed almost abandoned. I relied entirely on my map and compass, constantly checking my bearings. I had a general sense of direction, but in a dense forest, even a small misstep could throw everything off. In the late afternoon, I stumbled upon an area that didn't feel right. The trees were too uniform, the underbrush strangely flattened in places, as if something had passed through in large numbers recently. There were no tracks I could recognize, no deer, no bear, no human. But the signs were there. Something had been moving through the area. My stomach sank, a deep, cold feeling that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed my pace, scanning every tree, every shadow. The forest seemed alive, watching. I continued cautiously and soon heard something unmistakable. The sound of running water, but different from the river. Faster, more erratic. I turned to look, and for a moment, I saw movement. Shapes moving among the trees, shadows that weren't my own. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The movement stopped. I waited for several minutes, but there was nothing. I decided to move on, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps it was a large animal, a pack of coyotes, or even a bear. I knew bears were possible in this region, though attacks were rare. Still, the possibility lingered. I pressed on, keeping my eyes and ears sharp. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing by a hill that sloped gently down to a stream. It seemed safe enough to camp, so I began setting up my tent. I took extra care to build a small perimeter around my site, moving loose branches to create noise if something approached, arranging rocks around the fire pit, and keeping my knife within reach. I even created small traps, in a sense, sticks positioned to rattle if stepped on. Not that they would stop a large animal, but the noise might alert me in time. Night came quickly, darker than usual under a thick canopy. The sounds of the forest were constant. Wind through leaves, the rush of the stream, distant animal calls. But now I noticed something else. Occasional, faint footfalls on the ground, too heavy and irregular for deer, too light for a human carrying a pack. They seemed to circle my campsite at intervals, always stopping when I froze. Fear tightened around my chest, slow and steady. I reminded myself that animals were curious, sometimes aggressive, and that staying calm was the only way to survive. Hours passed. The footfalls continued intermittently. I stayed inside the tent, listening, waiting, my knife close, my fire burning low but steady. I refused to let panic take over, reminding myself that I was prepared, that I had the skills to survive in the backcountry. Eventually, the first hint of light crept through the canopy. I had survived the night, but my nerves were frayed, my body exhausted. The next morning, I made a decision. I could continue deeper into the forest, but the encounter, or whatever it had been, had shaken me. I would head back along a different route, moving cautiously, sticking to landmarks I could identify clearly. I packed everything carefully, checked my gear, and set off slowly. Every noise made me tense, but I kept moving, focused on staying alert. Hours later, I finally emerged from the dense forest onto a wider trail. The trees thinned, the sun warmed the ground, and I could hear the distant sound of a road. I felt a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. The isolation that had been thrilling and peaceful now felt oppressive. I continued along the trail until I reached my car, parked exactly where I had left it. The engine started without issue, and as I drove away, I looked back at the forest. The trip had been terrifying, exhausting, and tense, but I survived. I had planned carefully, acted cautiously, and trusted my instincts. The fear I had experienced was real, but it was also manageable because I stayed calm and focused. I realized that backcountry camping was as much a mental challenge as a physical one. Awareness, preparation, and respect for the wilderness were the only things that ensured survival. As I drove home, the forest shrinking behind me, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had faced the unknown, navigated it, and emerged intact. The experience left me both humbled and confident, aware that nature was unpredictable, but also rewarding when approached wisely. The story of this trip did not end in tragedy. I returned home with a new respect for wilderness, with memories of quiet streams, dense forests, and the adrenaline of nights that tested my senses. I told myself I would return one day, better prepared, more experienced, and still respectful of the wild. For now, I had survived. I had learned and I had grown, and that was a victory in itself. I never thought a camping trip could turn into something so unnerving, so raw, and so utterly exhausting, not just physically but mentally and emotionally as well. I had always loved the outdoors. The smell of pine, the soft crunch of dried leaves underfoot, the occasional distant call of a bird. It all made me feel alive, connected in a way that city life never could. I was used to being alone in nature, hiking long trails, setting up my own tent, cooking my own food, carrying everything I needed on my back. I prided myself on my preparation. I thought I had an instinct for knowing what could go wrong, what to avoid. I thought I could handle anything. I was wrong. It was late August when I planned this trip. The summer was ending, the heat still lingering in the days, but at night the temperature would drop significantly. I chose a national forest I had been to once before, a place deep enough to give me solitude, but not so far that I would be completely unreachable. My plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp near a small stream I knew about, spend 2 nights alone, and then hike back. Nothing fancy, no frills. Just me, my backpack, my tent, and the forest. I left early in the morning, carrying my usual gear. A backpack with food for 3 days, a water filter, a sleeping bag, a tent, extra clothing, a first aid kit, a small stove, and my knife. I also had a flashlight and some spare batteries, though I generally didn't like using artificial light unless absolutely necessary. I trusted my senses and my instincts more than gadgets. The hike in was uneventful, almost serene. The trail wound through tall pines, over small creeks, and along patches of wildflowers. I saw squirrels scampering, heard the distant hum of insects, and smelled the damp earth beneath the trees. By late afternoon, I reached the small clearing near the stream where I planned to set up camp. It was secluded, far enough from the main trail, with a mix of flat ground and natural windbreaks formed by fallen logs and rocks. I dropped my pack, breathed in the crisp air, and began setting up my tent. I always set it up facing the stream. I liked the sound of running water while I slept. It calmed me. Once the tent was secure, I explored the immediate area. I noticed animal tracks in the soft mud near the stream. Probably deer, maybe a raccoon or two. Nothing alarming. I built a small fire pit using stones I found nearby, carefully arranging them to contain the flames. I collected dry wood, knowing that a fire would be crucial not just for warmth, but for signaling if anything went wrong. By the time the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, I had everything in order. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, the scent of frying vegetables and rice mixing with the earthy forest smells, and then I sat back, listening to the gentle murmur of the stream, feeling the first bite of chill in the air. As darkness fell completely, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent shut, and tried to relax. I had a routine for nights alone. Check my surroundings, make sure my fire was contained, take note of the wind direction, and sleep lightly. I wasn't afraid of wild animals. I had been in the forest plenty of times, but I respected them. That night, I slept fitfully, waking occasionally to the sound of rustling leaves, the snap of a twig, or the distant call of an owl. It was normal. Then, the first strange thing happened. It was just past midnight when I woke suddenly to a sharp, persistent cracking sound. At first, I thought it was the wind breaking small branches, but the sound had a rhythm, deliberate and heavy. It wasn't far. I froze, listening, straining to distinguish it from the usual nighttime noises. My stomach tightened. The sound came closer, then paused, then continued. It wasn't animal-like. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy, like someone walking through the underbrush. I stayed still, quietly reaching for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was dark. The fire had died down to embers. First, I didn't see anything. Then I caught a movement at the edge of the trees. A silhouette that didn't belong. A figure moving slowly but with purpose. My heart jumped. I wasn't sure if it was human or not. My mind raced through possibilities, but the weight in my chest told me this was no deer, no raccoon. I quietly zipped the tent closed again, my hands trembling. I debated my next move. I could stay put and hope whoever or whatever it was left, or I could grab my gear and leave. The problem was my backpack was outside by the now dying fire. If I went for it, I would have to step out into the clearing, fully exposed. I waited, listening, every snap and crack of the forest sounding unnervingly loud. The figure stayed at the edge of the clearing for a long time, then moved again, slower, circling. It was aware I was there. I realized then that my survival depended on patience and strategy. I had to get out without attracting attention. I dug my small survival whistle out of my bag, not for scaring off an intruder, but as a last resort to alert anyone nearby, and slowly began to move toward my backpack, keeping low, using the fire pit and fallen logs as cover. The figure had moved closer to the other side of the clearing, which gave me a narrow window. Every step was deliberate, calculated. My breathing was shallow, my pulse racing. I reached my backpack, grabbed it, and carefully slung it over my shoulders. I paused, considering whether to grab the tent as well. I knew taking the tent down in the dark would be slow and noisy, probably impossible without drawing attention. I decided I couldn't risk it. Survival came first. I quietly unzipped the small compartment with my sleeping bag and some essential gear, grabbed everything vital, and prepared to leave the clearing. The next part was the hardest. I had to move through the trees in complete darkness. I had a faint idea of the trail, but without the moon, it was disorienting. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent my heart leaping. I pressed forward slowly, staying low, avoiding open spaces. Occasionally, I would hear the crunch of leaves behind me and freeze, holding my breath. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, just out of the corner of my eye. I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically. I had a map and compass, I knew the direction back to the main trail, and I stuck to it. Hours seemed to pass like minutes, and minutes stretched into what felt like endless time. I stumbled over roots, scraped my hands on bark, cut my arm on thorns. I didn't stop. I didn't allow myself to panic. My mind raced through every scenario. What if this person followed me? What if they wanted to rob me? Or worse? I imagined all the ways I could defend myself with my knife, my fire-starting tools, anything. Fear had sharpened every sense. Eventually, as dawn began to lighten the sky faintly, I reached a ridge I recognized. Relief flooded through me, but I stayed cautious, moving slowly until I could clearly see the main trail. When I finally stepped onto the well-trodden path, I felt a surge of safety. I didn't slow down, though. I kept moving until I reached my car parked at the trailhead. Every muscle in my body ached. Every nerve was raw, but I was alive. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away, my eyes scanning the forest behind me until it was out of sight. Afterward, I reported the incident to the park authorities. They took it seriously but had no immediate explanation. They increased patrols and reminded campers to stay vigilant. I realized later that the figure I saw could have been a criminal hiding in the forest, perhaps even someone watching campers for weeks. The forest is not just wild animals. Humans can be the most dangerous element. I didn't return to that forest for years. The experience stayed with me, the fear, the vigilance, the raw survival instinct kicking in. I learned how fragile a sense of safety can be, even in a place that feels familiar. I became meticulous in checking surroundings, in carrying emergency tools, in having a clear exit plan. Camping remained my passion, but it was tempered by respect not just for nature, but for the unpredictable and sometimes dangerous humans who move through it. I never saw the person again, but the memory of their presence, of the slow, deliberate steps circling me in the night, remained vivid. It changed me, made me more careful, more aware. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it is also a place where one misstep, one moment of inattention, can lead to real danger. I survived, and that survival, achieved through careful thought, patience, and determination, became something I carried with me every time I returned to the outdoors. I still remember the day I decided to go camping alone, though the memory is tangled in a strange mix of excitement and fear. I had been planning the trip for weeks. My goal was simple: find a quiet place deep in the wilderness, somewhere far from the noise of the city, where I could be alone with nature, breathe the fresh air, and push myself to survive on my own for a few days. I had done some solo camping before, but never this deep, never with such minimal preparation. I knew it was risky, but I had convinced myself I was ready. I had read countless survival blogs, studied maps, and packed carefully. My backpack contained a small tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, a first aid kit, a flashlight with spare batteries, a hatchet, a portable stove, some granola bars, and a small rope. I thought I had everything I might need. I had underestimated how quickly things could turn wrong, how isolation could twist normal nights into long, tense hours of fear. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived in the late afternoon. The parking area was empty except for a few scattered footprints from other hikers, and the forest loomed ahead like a wall of green. Tall trees stretched toward the sky, their thick trunks rough under my hand as I started down the dirt path. The smell of pine was heavy in the air, mingled with damp soil and fallen leaves. Every few steps, I could hear the faint sound of birds, their calls echoing through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and I felt a strange mix of calm and unease as I followed the trail deeper into the forest. At first, the hike was uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, over roots and rocks, past small streams and patches of wildflowers. The sunlight dappled through the canopy, creating moving patterns on the ground. I kept my pace steady, occasionally stopping to check my map and compass. My plan was to reach a clearing I had found marked on the map, a small plateau overlooking a river. It would be the perfect place to set up camp with flat ground and a view, but it was at least 10 miles from the trailhead. The first day of hiking went well. I felt strong, energized by the crisp air and the solitude. I drank from my water bottle, ate a granola bar, and kept moving, aware of the time, knowing I needed to reach the clearing before dark. By late afternoon, the trail became less defined. The trees grew closer together, and the underbrush thickened. I had to push through low branches and carefully step over tangled roots. At one point, I lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack a few hundred feet until I found the faint markers I had been following. My heart started to beat faster as I realized how quickly the path could disappear. The forest felt denser, quieter, and heavier with every step. The sun began to dip, and long shadows stretched across the ground. I knew I couldn't waste time. I pushed forward, finally reaching the edge of the clearing just as the last sliver of sunlight faded behind the trees. The plateau was beautiful, exactly as I had imagined. The river below sparkled faintly in the fading light, and the forest stretched endlessly on the other side. I set up my small tent on a flat patch of grass, careful to clear the ground of rocks and sticks. I made a small fire with dry kindling I had gathered, the flames flickering in the cool evening air. I ate a small meal, sipping water, and let myself relax for a moment, admiring the view and the quiet. I felt a sense of pride. I had made it. This was exactly what I had been seeking. Solitude, the sense of being completely alone in the wilderness. I was alone, but I felt safe, or at least I thought I did. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The gentle sounds of birds were replaced by the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, and distant calls of animals I couldn't identify. The night sky was clear, filled with stars. I lay in my sleeping bag for a while, staring at the sky, feeling small and insignificant in the vastness of the wilderness. Then, without warning, I heard a sound that made my heart jump, a low, distant growl. I froze, listening. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, and it carried through the trees in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I told myself it was probably a coyote or some other small predator. Nothing huge could be out here alone, I reasoned. Yet the growl repeated, closer this time. I could hear the crunch of leaves and branches nearby. My mind raced as I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dark forest. The beam caught nothing, only the shadows of trees and the glint of my own tent. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the growl came again, then silence. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept the fire low, the flashlight within reach, and my hatchet close. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me tense. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the fear was real, gnawing at me. Hours passed slowly. The fire burned down to embers, and the temperature dropped sharply. I shivered under my sleeping bag, too restless to sleep properly. At some point, I dozed lightly, only to wake to the sound of heavy footsteps around my tent. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, then moved again, circling. It wasn't human voices. No words, no laughter, just the deliberate, weighty sound of something moving near me. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet, considering whether I should leave the tent and confront it or hide. My mind raced, calculating options, but I didn't have any solid plan for a real encounter with a predator. The footsteps continued intermittently for what felt like hours. My fear didn't fade. I realized the growls were not just from one creature. They were layered, multiple sounds, like more than one animal moving around. My adrenaline kept me alert, but exhaustion weighed on me. At one point, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance, but I didn't relax. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound, imagining the worst-case scenarios. The forest at night had transformed from peaceful to threatening, every shadow a potential danger. The first night ended with me sitting half awake by the remaining embers of the fire, staring into the darkness until sunrise brought light and a fragile sense of safety. The next morning, I decided to stay alert but continue with my plan. I packed what I needed, leaving the fire pit cold and dark, and explored the plateau during daylight. The view was stunning, the river winding through the trees, sunlight reflecting off its surface. I tried to shake off the fear from the night before, convincing myself it had been exaggerated by isolation and my imagination. During the day, I gathered more firewood and started a stronger, controlled fire. I cooked a small breakfast and drank water filtered from the river. Despite my previous night, the forest seemed more familiar, almost comforting in the daylight. I spent several hours scouting the surrounding area, noting landmarks and potential hazards, making mental notes for safety. Everything seemed calm, natural, ordinary. I started to believe I could handle the isolation. Maybe the previous night had just been a fluke, I thought, a mixture of exhaustion and overactive imagination. But late that afternoon, as I prepared to collect more water from the river, I noticed fresh tracks near the edge of the plateau, large paw prints embedded in the damp soil. My heart stopped. The prints were too large for a coyote or a fox, too deliberate, too close to my camp. I traced them carefully, realizing they led up from the river toward the forest behind my tent. I didn't see the animal, but I could feel its presence. I felt panic rise again, that cold, sharp fear that had returned the night before. I knew immediately that leaving the plateau was dangerous, but staying was equally risky. I had only a limited amount of food and water, and I needed to survive at least one more night. I spent the remainder of the day preparing. I reinforced the perimeter around my tent with small logs and branches, placed rocks around the fire pit, and created a lookout position on a small rise that allowed me to see the surrounding forest. I improvised weapons, my hatchet, a sharpened stick, and rocks. I also made sure to keep extra water and granola within arm's reach. The sunlight faded quickly that evening, and I felt the creeping dread return. The growls started again, faint but deliberate, echoing across the clearing. I could hear the crunching of leaves and the snapping of twigs from multiple directions. Whatever was out there was circling, testing me, watching me. My body tensed as I kept my flashlight and hatchet ready. I reminded myself to stay calm, to think logically, but fear made it difficult. Every shadow, every movement felt amplified. The night stretched endlessly. I tried to keep my mind focused on survival, staying alert, monitoring the fire, rationing food and water, scanning the darkness. The sounds of animals were constant, layered, unpredictable. I had no way of knowing if it was a single predator or multiple. At one point, I thought I saw a large shadow moving just beyond the trees, barely visible in the dim firelight. I froze, heart racing, and waited. The shadow vanished. I realized I couldn't stay in one place too long, but I also knew leaving the plateau in the dark could be fatal. I spent that night crouched beside the fire, moving slowly and deliberately, listening, never closing my eyes fully. Exhaustion and fear combined to make time drag. Every hour felt like a day. By dawn, I was physically drained, my body stiff and sore, but the forest seemed quieter. The growls and footsteps had faded, at least temporarily. By the third day, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to leave. I had learned enough from the previous nights. The animal or animals were dangerous, likely large predators, probably bears. My plan was simple but required careful timing. I would wait until the early morning, move slowly and quietly, and head back to the main trail, sticking to open areas where I could see danger. I packed carefully, leaving nothing behind that could attract attention. I used my flashlight sparingly, relying on daylight. My senses were heightened, every sound and movement amplified. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, and I knew that any mistake could be fatal. The hike back was tense and exhausting. Every step required vigilance. I followed the faint trail marks, sometimes backtracking to confirm my position. At one point, I heard a deep growl nearby and froze, scanning the trees. I stayed completely still, waiting. The growl didn't come again, but my heart pounded relentlessly. I moved slowly, keeping low, using trees as cover. I rationed my water carefully and ate only small bites of granola. Hours passed, but eventually, I reached the wider trail I had started from. Relief washed over me, but I stayed alert, knowing that danger could still be nearby. By mid-afternoon, I finally saw the parking area where my car was parked. The sight was almost surreal. I was exhausted, dirty, and my muscles ached, but I was alive. The journey had tested me physically and mentally, pushing me to limits I hadn't imagined. I drove home slowly, reflecting on the experience. The fear, the isolation, the nights spent awake listening to growls and footsteps had changed me. I had survived not because of luck alone, but because I had stayed calm, observed, and adapted to the dangers around me. It was a realistic reminder that nature is beautiful but unforgiving, and that survival requires respect, caution, and constant awareness. I kept thinking about the footprints and the shadows I had seen. Whatever had been out there, I had survived by paying attention and keeping my wits. The experience stayed with me, a vivid memory of fear and endurance. I never underestimated the wilderness again. I had always been drawn to the woods, the way they felt endless and quiet, and the sense of escape they offered from the constant hum of the city. That weekend, I planned a solo camping trip deep in the mountains, a place I had scouted months earlier from maps and satellite images. The trailhead was secluded, with only a narrow dirt road leading to it. I had packed carefully. A small tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra water, and enough food to last a few days. I wanted this to be simple, clean, away from any distractions. I didn't expect it to turn into something I would remember for the rest of my life. Not just as an adventure, but as a warning about how quickly comfort can disappear in the wilderness. The first day was perfect. I started early, carrying a medium-weight backpack filled with supplies, navigating through narrow paths lined with tall pines. The air was fresh, carrying the earthy smell of damp leaves and moss. The sun dappled through the branches, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Occasionally, I would step on a branch that snapped loudly under my weight, sending birds scattering into the sky. I hiked steadily, stopping only to drink water or take small photographs of unusual mushrooms and insects. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing I had marked on my map as my camping spot. It was a small flat area near a shallow stream, with a few logs scattered around, likely the remnants of previous campers or hikers. The ground was dry enough to pitch a tent without worry, though the surrounding foliage was thick and darkening with the approach of evening. I set up my tent carefully, anchoring it against the uneven ground, making sure the rainfly was secure despite the clear weather. I unpacked some supplies and prepared a small fire pit with stones I gathered nearby. I had learned from past trips to always have a fire for warmth, cooking, and, if necessary, signaling. The sky above was turning a deep orange and red as the sun dipped toward the mountains. I cooked a simple meal of rice and beans, enjoying the quiet sounds of the forest. Everything felt normal, serene, and completely mine. I could hear the stream trickling nearby and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, nothing alarming at all. I slept that night with a sense of complete peace, listening to the forest sounds outside my tent. It was as if I was part of the wilderness, not just a visitor. The trouble started the next morning. I woke to the sun already high, filtered through the trees in uneven streaks. My first indication that something was off was a strange silence. Normally, mornings in the forest are full of birdsong and the calls of small animals, but this time, everything was quiet. I noticed that some of my gear seemed slightly out of place. My backpack was not aligned the way I left it, and the stones around my fire pit looked disturbed. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or a minor shift in the ground. I packed my belongings and decided to explore further along the trail I had planned, thinking that maybe I was imagining things. As I hiked, I began noticing subtle signs of something or someone else being there. Broken branches along the path, footprints that seemed larger than mine, and even what looked like a makeshift shelter hastily abandoned a few hundred meters off the trail. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, a constant pressure at the back of my mind. I reminded myself to stay rational. This was a popular camping area, perhaps other hikers had passed by, and I simply hadn't noticed. Still, the further I went, the more I realized that the signs were too deliberate. The footprints were unevenly spaced, like someone was trailing me but staying just far enough away to avoid being seen. By late afternoon, I decided to turn back to my campsite. That's when I noticed my tent. It was collapsed, not blown down by the wind, but torn in several places with the zippers ripped. My sleeping bag had been pulled out and dragged a few meters into the brush. My stomach sank. Whoever or whatever had done this had been inside my tent. My first instinct was panic, but I forced myself to breathe, thinking clearly. I checked my immediate surroundings. No one was in sight. I gathered my remaining supplies, stashed them in my backpack, and considered leaving immediately. But I was a few miles into the woods, and the trail back to the main road was longer than I realized. Nightfall was approaching, and with it came darkness I couldn't outrun. I set off cautiously, keeping to the path but scanning the woods continuously. The forest was changing. The light was dim, and the shadows grew long and thick. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, sounded magnified in the stillness. My heart rate climbed steadily. I tried to focus on the trail, counting steps, noting landmarks, but the forest seemed to twist in ways I didn't remember from the map. At one point, I realized I had passed a fallen tree I was sure had been there earlier, but now it looked like the path had been diverted around it. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming. Every few minutes, I would stop, turn slowly, and peer into the darkened underbrush. Nothing appeared, yet the sensation never left. Night fell completely while I was still on the trail. I had a small flashlight, but its beam cut only a thin path through the darkness. The forest was alive with sounds now. Rustling leaves, distant snapping twigs, and faint noises that I couldn't identify. Every sound made me jump. I tried to keep moving, but the path became less distinct. I started marking trees with small cuts on the bark, hoping to retrace my steps if necessary. That's when I saw a figure. At first, it was just a shadow among shadows, standing perfectly still. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It was just there. I strained my eyes, trying to make out details, but my heart pounded so loudly I was certain it could be heard by anyone nearby. Then, as quickly as I noticed it, it disappeared behind the trees. I don't think it ran, I don't think it walked. It just vanished into the forest. That's when I realized. Someone had been watching me for hours, maybe since my first night. I had been entirely unaware. Panic took over, but I forced myself to think. The nearest road was still miles away. My phone had no signal, my emergency beacon was in my tent, now destroyed. I had nothing except the supplies on my back and the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. I decided I had to move steadily and avoid drawing attention. I walked cautiously but quickly, avoiding open clearings and sticking to thick cover. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. I kept imagining eyes on me from the darkness. Several times, I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my hands and knees, but I forced myself onward. I could feel the forest closing in, each tree appearing like a looming wall. Hours passed. Exhaustion set in. My legs ached, my back was sore, and the adrenaline was waning, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling fatigue. At some point, I stopped to rest behind a large boulder, catching my breath and trying to think logically. I realized that if I kept moving, I had a chance to reach the road by dawn, but if I stopped for too long, whoever was out there could find me, possibly corner me. I had to keep moving. I rationed the last of my water and snacks, determined to survive the night. I kept my flashlight off unless absolutely necessary, relying on the faint moonlight and my memory of the terrain. Every rustle, every movement was magnified in the silence, and I couldn't tell if it was a small animal or something else entirely. By the early morning hours, I was completely disoriented. I had no sense of distance or direction. My shoes were soaked from a small creek crossing, and my hands were scraped from holding onto branches and rocks. I started shouting, hoping my voice would carry to any nearby hikers or roads. I knew it was dangerous, shouting could draw attention to me, but at that point I had to try. My voice echoed through the trees, bouncing off trunks and leaves, but no one answered. I began to feel despair creeping in, the type that gnaws at your mind, making you imagine threats where there may be none. Then, just as the first hints of sunrise colored the sky, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine. My heart leapt. I ran toward the noise, stumbling over roots and stones, falling several times, and finally reaching a narrow dirt road cutting through the forest. A small pickup truck approached, and I flagged it down frantically. The driver stopped, looked at me with surprise, and I realized that I must have looked like a wild figure myself, covered in dirt, scratches, and leaves. I collapsed into the passenger seat, shaking, breathing hard, my voice barely forming coherent words. The driver understood immediately that I was in distress and radioed for help. Within the hour, park rangers arrived, checking the area I had been camping and hiking through. They found no one else, but they noted the signs of another presence: footprints, makeshift shelter, and disturbed gear. I never learned who had been following me, but the experience left a permanent mark. I realized how small and vulnerable a person can be in the wilderness, even when prepared. The forest, beautiful and serene in daylight, could turn into a place of fear and uncertainty in hours. That trip, which had started as a simple escape, became a lesson in caution, vigilance, and the raw unpredictability of nature and other humans. I returned home, shaken, but also alive, with a newfound respect for the wilderness and the importance of preparation and awareness. The experience remained with me for years, a constant reminder that the line between adventure and danger is often thinner than we think, and that survival is as much about mental endurance as it is about physical strength. I had planned this camping trip for months. I wanted something alone, far from the usual weekend crowds and trails littered with people, tents, and campers. I had studied maps of the area, found a remote forest with no official campgrounds, and convinced myself that I had prepared for every possible risk. My backpack was heavy with all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and a small hatchet. I even brought a couple of bear spray canisters, though I was hoping I would never have to use them. I told myself I was ready, that I was careful, and that nothing could go wrong. The first day of the hike started perfectly. The sun was warm but not too hot, the trail quiet except for the occasional chirping of birds. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the forest smell of pine and damp soil. Every few minutes, I stopped to take pictures of unusual mushrooms or the patterns of sunlight filtering through the leaves. The trail was rugged, but manageable, and I was in high spirits. I kept thinking about how peaceful it would be to fall asleep that night with no one else around, just the sounds of the forest. By mid-afternoon, I reached the area I had chosen to camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. There was a stream nearby, water clear and cold, perfect for refilling my bottles. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was on slightly higher ground in case of rain. I unpacked my gear, organized my stove and supplies, and sat back to look around. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so. Every rustle of leaves sounded exaggerated in the calm air. I felt safe, almost too safe. After a light dinner of canned beans and some jerky, I built a small fire. I sat close enough to feel its warmth, but far enough to keep from smelling like smoke. I watched the flames dance, listening to the water in the stream, and felt a rare sense of solitude that I had been craving. Darkness fell fast, faster than I expected. The sun dipped behind the trees, shadows stretching across the clearing. turning everything into a mix of deep gray and black. I took out my flashlight, even though I wanted to rely mostly on the firelight. I told myself that staying alert was important, that even in a safe-feeling place, the forest could turn dangerous without warning. Then it started. At first, it was subtle. A snapping branch somewhere in the distance, followed by another. I froze. I wasn't expecting animals at this hour, at least not this close. My imagination raced. Could be a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a fox. I told myself it was nothing. But then came a soft rustling from the underbrush nearby. My pulse quickened. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing. Then I heard the faintest sound of breathing, or maybe it was the wind. It was hard to tell. I tried to calm myself. "It's just a deer," I said silently. "It's just a deer." But the noises didn't stop. Branches snapped again, closer this time. Something was moving just at the edge of the clearing. My stomach tightened, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for the bare spray. I knew my firelight made me visible, but I didn't want to leave it. I tried to make myself rational. I was alone, but people did hike here. It could be another camper, though that felt unlikely this late in the evening. Suddenly, a loud, sharp snap came from the other side of the clearing. Something had moved fast. I swung my flashlight toward it and froze. My heart hammered as I saw a shadow disappear into the darkness. Not an animal shadow, too large, too deliberate. I grabbed the hatchet from the ground beside me, holding it like a lifeline. I tried to stay calm, breathing quietly, telling myself I wasn't going to panic. I told myself I could handle this. Then came a sound I will never forget. Heavy footsteps, slow but deliberate, crunching through leaves and twigs. They were coming closer. My pulse felt like it would burst from my chest. I looked at my fire, suddenly wishing it were bigger, brighter, something to keep me safe. But it was small and flickering, inadequate against the darkness around me. I thought about running, but I had no idea which way to go. The forest all looked the same in the dark. And if whoever or whatever was out there saw me running, it could be worse. I stayed frozen. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the firelight. I could hear breathing now, steady, not panicked. Someone was watching me. I gripped the hatchet tighter, telling myself to stay quiet, stay still, don't give away your position. I didn't even try to make a sound, hoping that somehow, staying invisible might work. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, I heard a voice, low, calm, almost casual, calling my name. My stomach dropped. How did they know my name? I had told no one exactly where I was going. I hadn't even posted my exact location anywhere. Panic rose in waves. I realized I had to move before they approached closer. Slowly, I picked up my backpack, keeping it between me and the shadowed figure. I edged toward the trees behind my tent, hoping to make it to the stream where I might disappear or at least have better terrain to defend myself. Every step made my heart race. Every crack of a branch felt like a gunshot. I was aware of every sound I made. Suddenly, I tripped over a root. My backpack flung forward, making a loud thud. The footsteps reacted immediately, moving toward me with speed I hadn't anticipated. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline taking over completely. I didn't look back. I ran into the forest, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me again. My flashlight bounced wildly, barely illuminating the path in front of me. My only thought was to get away anywhere and survive. I ran through the forest blindly for what felt like an eternity, adrenaline and fear fueling me. I stumbled into a shallow ditch, scraped my hands and knees, but didn't stop. I could hear the person behind me now, faster, breathing heavily. Panic overwhelmed me. My mind raced through everything I had learned about survival, about self-defense, about staying alive in the wilderness. I remembered a trick. Water slows down pursuers. I aimed for the stream. Finally, I reached the stream and jumped in, letting the cold water shock my body awake. I kept low, letting the current carry me slightly downstream, hoping it would mask my scent or at least confuse the person following. I stayed in the water, shivering and exhausted, until I thought it was safe to move again. Eventually, I crawled out, soaked and trembling. My flashlight was lost somewhere in the rush. My hatchet was gone too. I had nothing but my backpack and my will to survive. I decided to keep moving downstream, hoping to find a road or trail. I didn't dare go back to the campsite. It was too dangerous. Hours passed. The forest was alive with night sounds, insects and animals that seemed deafening after the terror of earlier. I kept slipping into the stream, crawling over wet rocks, cutting myself on branches and thorns, but I refused to stop. I knew that if I stayed still, I was as good as caught. Eventually, I saw lights in the distance. They were faint but unmistakable. Someone had to be there. I ran, shouting, waving my arms. Finally, I stumbled into a small ranger station. The people inside were startled, but after I explained, they immediately called the police. They gave me blankets, hot tea, and a place to rest. Later, police went back to my campsite and discovered that someone had been watching me for hours, hiding in the trees. They never caught him, but he was clearly experienced, dangerous, and possibly a serial predator. In the days afterward, I went back with police to document everything. My campsite was in disarray, my gear partially destroyed, and clear signs of someone lurking and waiting for me. The fear lingered, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. I survived, I made it out, and I learned something critical. Preparation was important, but instinct and the will to survive mattered more. I never went back to that forest, and I never camped alone in such remote places again. But I learned that real fear, is not about shadows or ghosts. It is about real threats, real humans, and real danger. And I had faced it, and I had come out alive. I had been planning the trip for months. I had a small break from work, no pressing obligations, and I wanted to get away from the constant noise of the city. The idea was simple: a solo camping trip deep in the forest, far enough from any main roads that I wouldn't see a soul for days. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of isolation that strips life down to its most basic elements. The kind of isolation that makes you notice things you normally ignore. I drove most of the day to reach the trailhead. The forest was in the northern range of the state, a place I had only been once before, years ago, and even then I barely ventured in. The road turned from asphalt to gravel and finally to a dirt path that seemed to disappear into the trees. The GPS signal dropped as I drove, warning me that I would be on my own for a while. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked near the trailhead, packed my gear on my back, and started walking. The first few hours were easy. The sun was high, shining through the trees, making patterns on the forest floor. I had mapped out a route I thought would keep me close to a small creek I remembered from the map. Water, after all, was vital, and I had packed extra, but nothing beats fresh water from a stream. I moved slowly, not wanting to exhaust myself too soon. Every few minutes, I would stop to check my compass, make a note in my journal, or take pictures. It was quiet. Birds chirped, leaves rustled. A small breeze occasionally stirred the scent of damp earth and pine. By late afternoon, I had reached a clearing near the creek I had been aiming for. It wasn't large, but it was enough for my tent. I picked the flattest spot I could find, away from dead trees that might fall in a windstorm, and set up my tent. I was methodical in my setup, making sure the tent was tight, the rainfly secure, and the ground sheet properly laid. I arranged my gear neatly inside, keeping my food in a bear-proof container a few feet away. Everything was organized. I was alone, yes, but I wasn't careless. I spent the next hour gathering firewood. Dry branches, dead pine needles, larger logs for later, and smaller twigs for kindling. I set them in a small pile near where I intended to build the fire, taking care not to scatter them too far. As the sun began to lower, the shadows lengthened and the forest changed. The air became cooler, the forest darker. The sunlight that filtered through the trees took on an orange glow, and every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of a small animal, suddenly seemed louder. I started the fire. It was simple enough, but I made sure it would last. I built a small circle of stones around it, and soon I had a steady flame. I cooked a simple meal: canned beans, some sausages I had brought, and boiled some water for tea. The smell of the fire mixed with the scent of my cooking. It was satisfying. Alone in the forest, I felt alive. As night fell, the forest changed completely. The shadows became longer, deeper, and the sounds shifted. I could hear the distant howl of a coyote or wolf, though I couldn't be sure which. The wind made the trees creak. Owls called intermittently. Every rustle of leaves sounded like something approaching, but each time I checked, nothing was there. I told myself it was just the forest, just the night. Still, I made sure to keep my fire going. Darkness in a forest is something else entirely. It swallows sound and sight in ways that nothing else can. Sleep came slowly. I stayed up longer than I should have, watching the fire, listening. Around midnight, I heard something different. A sound I hadn't heard before. Not a wolf or bird. Footsteps. Deliberate. Slow. Crunching leaves. Twigs snapping. It didn't circle my camp. It approached, stopped, retreated a few feet, then moved again. My heart started to race, but I stayed calm. I reminded myself of the basics. I was not in danger if I stayed alert. The noise continued for almost an hour, never getting closer than 30 feet from the fire. I shined my flashlight in every direction. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but trees, branches, and darkness. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I wasn't sure if whatever it was had left or just waited. I stayed awake for hours, checking my knife, keeping my fire alive, and monitoring the surroundings. Dawn eventually came, though I hardly slept. The next day, I decided to explore further along the creek. I followed the water upstream, noting the landmarks, taking care to remember every turn. The terrain grew more rugged, the trees denser. It was harder to move without tripping over roots or slipping on wet rocks. I found small wildlife tracks. Deer, perhaps, and smaller creatures I couldn't identify. Nothing human. That day, I saw a fox, some birds, and a snake crossing my path, but nothing threatening. That night, the fire again became my anchor. I ate, organized my gear, and double-checked my surroundings. The footsteps returned, though this time they were accompanied by other noises. Branches snapping farther away, rustling in the underbrush. I held my flashlight and listened carefully. Then I saw movement, a figure partially obscured by shadows, moving between trees. Not directly toward me, not attacking, just moving. I froze. My survival instincts kicked in. I remained in the firelight, making myself visible, but stayed quiet. The figure lingered at the edge of the firelight, then disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too alert to sleep, watching, listening. The next day, I decided to explore further along the creek. I followed the water upstream, noting the landmarks, taking care to remember every turn. The terrain grew more rugged, the trees denser. It was harder to move without tripping over roots or slipping on wet rocks. I found small wildlife tracks. Deer, perhaps, and smaller creatures I couldn't identify. Nothing human. That day, I saw a fox, some birds, and a snake crossing my path, but nothing threatening. That night, the fire again became my anchor. I ate, organized my gear, and double-checked my surroundings. The footsteps returned, though this time they were accompanied by other noises. Branches snapping farther away, rustling in the underbrush. I held my flashlight and listened carefully. Then I saw movement, a figure partially obscured by shadows, moving between trees. Not directly toward me, not attacking, just moving. I froze. My survival instincts kicked in. I remained in the firelight, making myself visible, but stayed quiet. The figure lingered at the edge of the firelight, then disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too alert to sleep, watching, listening. The next day, I knew I couldn't stay in the same location. I packed my gear carefully and planned to hike out through a different trail. The forest felt alive now in a way that was oppressive. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow made me look twice. I had to stay rational, but my nerves were raw. I stuck close to the creek, hoping it would lead me to a recognizable landmark or eventually to a road. Hours into the hike, the terrain became more treacherous. Rocks were slick from morning dew, branches hung low, and the underbrush thickened. I stumbled several times but caught myself. At one point, I realized I had left the trail I had mapped in my mind. The forest all looked the same, dense, green, tangled. My compass showed a general direction, but there were no visible paths. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew I had to keep moving, find water if I could, and avoid making too much noise. By late afternoon, I found a small natural clearing near the creek. I decided to rest briefly, eat, and refill my water bottle. The place was quiet, except for the normal forest sounds. I sat on a rock, taking long breaths. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Not far, not right at the edge, but definitely someone or something moving deliberately through the forest. I froze, heart hammering. I had left my knife in my pack, a few feet away. I told myself it could be another hiker, someone like me, but the idea didn't feel right. The footsteps circled around, never approaching directly, but always nearby. I gathered my courage, picked up my backpack, and decided I had to move before darkness fell. The forest would be far more dangerous at night, especially if whoever was out there was following me. I followed the creek, moving faster, trying not to make noise that would give away my position too clearly. Every few minutes, I would glance behind me. Shadows shifted in the corner of my eyes. I convinced myself it was nerves until I saw them. Footprints in the soft mud near the creek. Fresh footprints. Human. They weren't random. They followed me. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced it down. I focused on rational steps. I had food, water, and a backpack. I could survive the night if I found a safe spot, but staying put wasn't safe. I remembered that the trail map indicated a ranger station about 3 miles downstream. I decided to aim for that, even if it meant navigating through the forest in near darkness. Night fell and the forest became oppressive. I stuck close to the creek, moving cautiously. The footprints continued, and at some points, I heard whispers carried by the wind, though it was likely my mind playing tricks, fear amplifying every sound. I kept moving, careful to step lightly, avoid snapping branches. After nearly 2 hours of tense movement, I spotted a faint light through the trees. A building, the ranger station. Relief flooded me, but I stayed cautious. I approached slowly, making no sudden movements. When I reached the station, I found the door unlocked. Inside, I found basic supplies, maps, radio, first aid kits. I turned on the radio, called in my location, explained that I had been hiking alone and might have been followed. A ranger confirmed they were on their way. I finally allowed myself to relax, though I stayed alert. I set up a small fire outside the station, keeping watch until the ranger arrived. When they reached me, they examined the area and confirmed my suspicion. The footprints I had seen weren't normal hikers. Local law enforcement had been tracking a group of illegal loggers in the forest who had been following and harassing campers. They had not encountered me directly, but my awareness and caution had likely prevented a confrontation. The rangers escorted me safely back to the road and eventually to my car. I left the forest that day, exhausted but alive, carrying a lesson I would never forget. Isolation in the wilderness is humbling, and being prepared is crucial. I had survived through vigilance, rational thinking, and patience. The fear had been real, intense, and physical, but it had not defeated me. I returned home, still shaken, but also proud of having endured the tension, the uncertainty, and the raw, unfiltered reality of being alone in the wild. Even weeks later, I could still feel the forest around me, the weight of the darkness, the sound of footsteps in the distance, the sense of being watched. But I had survived, and that survival was mine alone. I had walked into the forest seeking solitude and had found both terror and resilience. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything, from the constant noise of the city and the endless stream of work emails and obligations. My plan was simple. Head deep into the wilderness, far from roads, far from cell service, and spend a few days entirely alone. I packed carefully, double-checking each item. I had enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, a first aid kit, and a small pocket knife. I had told no one exactly where I was going. I didn't want anyone to call or text, not for a few days. That was the whole point. Solitude, silence, and nature. The drive out of the city was long and quiet. The sun was already sinking low by the time I reached the trailhead. The air smelled fresher as I left the asphalt behind, replaced with the rich, earthy scent of pine, soil, and damp leaves. I parked my car in a small clearing and started hiking along a narrow dirt trail. First, the path was easy. It wound along a small creek, the water glinting in the fading light. Birds flitted between the trees, and I could hear the occasional rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe, because the silence that filled the gaps between the natural sounds felt almost heavy, almost unnatural in its stillness. I hiked for about 3 hours before I decided to make camp. The trail started to narrow and climb steeply, and I knew I needed to find a flat area before darkness fell. I found a small clearing just off the trail, surrounded by thick pine trees. It was private, hidden, and almost perfect. I unpacked my gear and set up the tent, carefully securing it against the wind that had begun to pick up. I built a small fire ring with rocks and gathered dry branches for a fire. I wanted light and warmth, a small anchor against the overwhelming dark that would come soon. As I worked, I felt a flicker of unease. The woods seemed to press in on me from all sides, dense and silent. No wind rustled the treetops here, no birds sang. Even the creek, which had been lively along the trail, was distant now, a faint trickle far below the clearing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't completely leave. By the time I finished setting up camp, it was nearly dark. I started a small fire, the crackling flames illuminating the clearing. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans, savoring the quiet and the simplicity of it. There was no phone, no messages, no interruptions. Just me, the fire, and the dark forest surrounding me. As the night deepened, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The sounds of the forest were faint, mostly the wind shifting in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. But then I noticed something else. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the clearing. My stomach tightened. I was alone. I knew I was alone, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was moving out there. I stayed completely still, listening. The steps would pause, then start again, moving closer, then farther away, circling the tent. My heart raced, my mind trying to reason it out. Deer? Maybe, but deer don't make that kind of deliberate, heavy step noise. Wolves? I had read about wolves hunting in packs at night, but the sound wasn't right for them either. Too steady, too measured. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it outside the tent, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Just shadows, branches, and the dim glow of the fire. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that the mind plays tricks in the dark. But the steps continued, faint but relentless, circling my camp. I decided to wait it out. I kept the fire burning bright, knowing that light might be the only thing keeping something or someone from approaching. Hours passed slowly. The rhythmic sound moved intermittently, sometimes stopping entirely, sometimes returning. My body tensed constantly, ready to jump, fight, or run. I slept in short, tense bursts, waking each time the noise returned. Morning came gray and misty. The clearing looked different in daylight. It was beautiful, peaceful almost, with rays of light filtering through the trees and mist curling around the rocks and branches. I wanted to tell myself I had imagined everything, that the footsteps were just shadows and wind. But then I saw the signs. The footprints were faint in the soft soil around the clearing, large and deliberate. Not animal, but human. Someone had been circling my camp during the night. My stomach sank. I had come into the wilderness to be alone, to escape people, and yet someone had been there, moving silently around me, unseen. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but I needed a plan. The trail I had come in on was narrow and easy to follow, but it would take hours to hike back to the road. If the person was still nearby, leaving could make me vulnerable. I decided to stay put for the day, maintaining a fire and keeping an eye on the edges of the clearing. The day passed slowly. I moved cautiously, fetching water from the creek and gathering firewood while keeping a constant watch. I reinforced the perimeter of my camp as best I could, stacking extra rocks and logs around the fire to create a small barrier. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow made my heart race. The isolation that had felt freeing yesterday now felt like a trap. By nightfall, I was exhausted, but the steps returned. I had heard about hikers encountering other people in the wilderness, sometimes friendly, sometimes not, but this was different. Whoever had been here moved with intent, staying out of sight but making their presence known, testing me, watching me. The fire was brighter this time, the smoke curling higher, and I held my knife ready, tense, alert, my mind spinning with possibilities and worst-case scenarios. The night dragged on. I barely slept, listening to the slow, deliberate steps moving around my camp, sometimes pausing just beyond the edge of the firelight. My fear built in layers, each rustle of leaves or snapping branch sending adrenaline surging through my body. I realized that if I wanted to survive, I had to act carefully. Running blindly through the forest in the dark was more dangerous than waiting. At dawn, the forest seemed empty again. The mist hung low, and the footprints I had seen yesterday were still visible, but no new ones appeared overnight. I felt the first real sense of relief, but it was tentative. I packed my gear quickly and quietly, keeping the fire smoldering so it might give the illusion of continued occupancy. I moved slowly along the trail, staying alert to every sound, every movement. Hours later, I reached a point where the trail widened and I could see a logging road in the distance. Relief washed over me. I hurried along the trail, staying low, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. When I finally reached the road, I paused to catch my breath. No one was there. No cars, no hikers, no movement. I felt a wave of gratitude and exhaustion at the same time. I walked along the road until I saw a truck parked near the intersection and a man getting into it. I waved frantically and he stopped. I ran to the vehicle, explaining in rushed, halting words that I had been camping in the forest, alone, and someone had been stalking my camp. He listened, nodded, and offered to drive me to the nearest ranger station. At the ranger station, I filed a report. They asked for the details, examined the footprints I had photographed, and confirmed my fear. Someone had been moving around my camp, watching, waiting, and I had narrowly avoided a potential encounter that could have been dangerous. They advised me not to return to that area alone and to always notify someone of my location. In the weeks afterward, I reflected on what had happened. I realized that nature is unpredictable, yes, but so are people. The wilderness might seem safe because of its isolation, but it can also hide dangers you never expect. I never returned to that clearing, never ventured alone so deep again, and always carried extra precautions. Whistle, bear spray, GPS tracker, and a plan in case someone else was nearby. I survived that trip, but it changed the way I approached the wilderness. Peace and solitude are powerful, but vigilance is essential. You can't assume that being alone means being safe. That trip taught me to respect not only the forest and its creatures, but also the unknown presence of other people, moving silently where you least expect them. It was terrifying, but I came out of it alive, wiser, and more prepared. I still think about that night, about the slow, deliberate steps circling my camp, the way someone had been there, watching me without revealing themselves. I imagine them still moving through the forest, unseen, testing the limits of those who wander too far. And I know now that fear, preparation, and awareness can save you, even when you feel utterly alone. I never forgot that first morning after the night in the clearing. The mist over the trees, the faint footprints in the soil, the quiet threat lingering in every shadow. They are burned into my memory. But I also remember the relief when I saw the road, the stranger's truck, and the realization that I had survived. That clarity, the end of the terror, and the knowledge that I had acted carefully enough to protect myself. That is the memory I carry with me. I learned, in that forest, that fear can be managed, danger can be anticipated, and survival is possible if you keep your wits about you. The forest remains beautiful. It remains peaceful, but I will never enter it blindly again, and I will always respect the unknown. That night, the quiet terror and the relief afterward taught me lessons I carry to this day. Preparedness matters, solitude can be deceptive, and human beings are unpredictable, sometimes more so than the wilderness itself. I had planned this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, from the constant noise, the constant lights, the constant people. I needed the silence and the isolation that only deep wilderness could offer. I drove for hours, the asphalt slowly giving way to gravel roads, then dirt paths, then a narrow track barely wide enough for my small SUV. The sun was still high when I reached the trailhead, and the forest stretched out in every direction, dense and quiet, with tall pines and oaks and the faint sound of a creek somewhere down the slope. I parked and checked my gear, making sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid, flashlight, fire starting kit, map, compass, a hatchet, and a small folding knife. I had been camping before, plenty of times, but this time I was going alone, and that added a layer of weight I couldn't ignore. Alone meant no help if something went wrong. The hike to my planned campsite was longer than I expected. The trail wound steeply up, twisted around rocky outcrops, and occasionally disappeared under fallen trees or overgrown brush. My boots crunched against dry leaves and sticks, and I paused often to catch my breath, wipe sweat from my forehead, and glance at the forest around me. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. The sunlight flickered through the branches, creating patches of light that danced on the forest floor. At times, the wind rustled the trees so loudly it felt like the whole forest was alive, whispering and creaking, and I remembered why I loved it. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a rocky ridge. There was space enough to pitch my tent, a flat patch of ground without too many roots or stones. I set up camp carefully, hammering stakes and making sure the rainfly was secure. Then I gathered wood for a fire. I wanted a fire before night fell completely. It was comforting, practical, and it kept wild animals at bay. I stacked logs in a pyramid, smaller twigs inside, ready to spark a flame. As I worked, I noticed small signs of wildlife: claw marks on tree trunks, chewed pine cones, and distant bird calls. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew longer and sharper. There was a stillness that pressed against me, almost heavy, and I felt my pulse quicken slightly. That was normal, I reminded myself, but the quiet seemed too perfect, almost unnatural. By the time I had my fire going, the forest was a different place. Shapes moved in the darkness just beyond the light. The firelight made long shadows that twisted and shifted as I fed logs into it. I ate my dinner, instant noodles with some dried vegetables I had rehydrated, and drank water. I felt full but alert. I tidied my campsite and secured all my food in a bear-proof container. The smell of food can travel far, I knew, and I wanted to avoid any unwanted visitors. As darkness fully descended, the forest became a black wall around me, pierced only by the flickering firelight. Around 10 p.m., I went to lie down in my tent. I could hear the night creatures now, their noises amplified in the stillness. A distant owl, the soft rustling of a small animal through leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Sleep came slowly. I kept thinking about sounds in the dark, trying to identify them, trying not to imagine anything dangerous. Eventually, exhaustion won. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. My tent was dark, but there was a sound, soft, almost inaudible, a snapping of a twig close by. I froze. My flashlight was within reach, so I grabbed it and shone it outside. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing, just the trees. I could see the fire, now reduced to embers, glowing faintly. But something didn't feel right. I listened. Another snap, then a third. These were close. Too close for the normal movement of animals. I felt my stomach tighten. I had always trusted my senses, and now every instinct was screaming that something was out there, moving carefully, watching. I grabbed my knife and unzipped the tent just enough to peek. The fire was almost gone. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the dim light. I saw nothing at first. Then I caught movement. A dark shape slinking between trees, silent, deliberate. My heart hammered. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically. Could be a deer, a raccoon, anything. But instinct screamed that it wasn't. I stayed quiet for what felt like hours, listening. The rustling came closer. My flashlight was dead. Forgotten to check batteries properly, and I was plunged into near-total darkness, only the faint glow from embers remaining. Panic edged in. I considered running, but in the dark forest, running was dangerous. I could fall, twist an ankle, and then I would be defenseless. My mind raced. I needed a plan. I remembered my backpack. I could grab my food container. It was heavy metal, could be used as a weapon. I grabbed it and quietly unzipped the tent. The cold night air hit my face. My ears strained. There it was again. A soft, deliberate sound. Something heavy moving across dry leaves. My eyes adjusted. I could see vague shapes, dark against darker. Then I saw the movement. A person. Not an animal. A human, crouched low, moving deliberately through the underbrush. Eyes glinting faintly in the ember light. Fear consumed me. I thought about what I could do. Shouting was risky. It could provoke them. I slowly reached for my fire-starting kit, thinking I could create light and perhaps scare them off. But even as I moved, they froze, like they had noticed me without being seen. That frozen moment was terrifying. I remembered everything I had ever read about wilderness survival and dangerous encounters. I needed to appear larger, more threatening, more in control. I grabbed a long stick nearby and held the food container in one hand, ready to swing. Then I slowly backed toward a tree, thinking of climbing if necessary. I waited, every muscle tensed. The figure moved again cautiously. Then I noticed something. A flashlight beam far in the distance, and the faint sound of footsteps crunching under leaves, coming from a different direction. Relief and tension mingled. It wasn't just me. Maybe someone else was nearby. Suddenly, the person in front of me froze, then turned and ran into the forest. I didn't follow. I stayed where I was, breathing hard, listening. Minutes passed. The forest returned to its near silence, broken only by small animal sounds. I realized I had survived a close encounter with someone, probably another camper or a hiker, maybe with bad intentions. My hands shook, but I felt a surge of cautious triumph. By dawn, I had packed my camp. I didn't eat, didn't make another fire, and kept a knife ready. The forest seemed less menacing in the morning light, though I could still see where footprints crisscrossed my camp. I traced them, saw the marks of boots, hurried steps, but no faces. I started hiking back down the trail, careful and alert. Every sound made me glance over my shoulder. Every shadow made my heart jump. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then, I stayed inside for a long time, doors locked, staring at the trees. I left the forest that day shaken, exhausted, but alive. The memory of being alone in that darkness, the soft sound of deliberate footsteps, the realization that someone had been watching me, stayed with me for years. But it also taught me something. Preparation matters, awareness matters, and calmness under pressure can make the difference between life and death. I returned to camping eventually, but I always remembered that night, and I carried a healthy respect for the forest and for the unknown dangers that can exist in what seems like an empty wilderness. By the time I drove back to the city, the fear had faded into a strange mix of relief and reflection. I had survived the night, had trusted my instincts, and had stayed alive without confrontation. The experience left me stronger, more cautious, more aware of how fragile safety can be. And though I continued to love the wilderness, I never took solitude lightly again. Every hike, every camp, I carried the lesson of that night with me. Silence can hide danger, shadows can hide people, and being prepared is the only true protection. I had always loved camping, but this trip was different from the others. I wanted to go somewhere far from roads and people, a place that felt truly wild. I planned it carefully, mapping a route into a dense forest area that was far from any town or main trail. I packed my backpack with enough supplies for several days. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, enough food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a sturdy knife. I double-checked everything before leaving, making sure I had all the essentials for survival, because I was determined to be self-sufficient. I left early in the morning, the air crisp with the scent of frost, my boots crunching through the dry leaves that covered the ground. The forest was quiet in a way that felt almost heavy. The sun filtered through the high branches, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. I followed the path I had marked on my map, though after a few hours I realized the trail markers had disappeared. I could hear the distant sound of a stream somewhere to my right, and the wind moved the treetops in a low, whispering rhythm. I had a compass, so I relied on it to navigate, making small mental notes of landmarks along the way. A jagged rock formation here, a fallen pine tree there, and a small clearing that seemed to open into a valley. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, but there was a faint tension in the air that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing beside a creek. It seemed perfect for camping. The ground was mostly flat, and there were enough dry branches to start a fire if I needed one. I decided to set up my tent, laying out the footprint first, then assembling the poles and pulling the fabric tight. I secured it with stakes and tied extra guy lines to nearby trees to make sure it would withstand any wind. I unpacked my sleeping bag and rolled it neatly inside, then stored my food in a bear-proof container. Even though I wasn't sure if bears were common in this area, I always preferred to be safe. The sun began to dip behind the trees as I set about gathering firewood. I stacked branches in a pile, separating small twigs for kindling from larger logs for sustained burning. My hands were sore from walking all day, and my muscles ached, but I felt a quiet satisfaction. I started the fire carefully, striking a lighter several times until the twigs caught. The flames flickered to life, and I could hear the faint crackle of burning wood. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned vegetables, pouring a bit of water over it to heat it up. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth from the fire, the taste of food after a long day of hiking. As night fell, the forest became darker and more silent, except for the soft murmur of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I lay inside my sleeping bag for a while, staring at the small opening of my tent that framed the night sky. Stars glimmered faintly through the canopy, and the air grew colder. I checked my supplies once more, ensuring I had water within reach and my knife ready. I thought I had accounted for everything, every possible scenario. But there's always something you don't see coming, something that the best preparations can't prevent. Around midnight, I woke suddenly to a snapping sound outside my tent. It was sharp, distinct, like a branch breaking under weight. My heart jumped, and I stayed very still, listening. Then I heard it again, a step, slow and deliberate, moving closer to where I had gathered my firewood. I gripped my knife, trying to calm my breathing. I knew the forest held animals, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy for a deer or a fox. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would go away. The sounds circled the tent once, then paused. I could feel a presence outside, just beyond the fabric, and I realized my fire had burned down to embers that barely glowed in the dark. I thought about my options. I could leave the tent and investigate, but that would mean stepping into the unknown, unarmed except for a knife. I could stay inside, but if it were a human, staying quiet might not be enough. I decided to quietly get my flashlight, keeping the knife in one hand. I unzipped the tent just slightly, just enough to peek outside. Nothing moved. The shadows from the trees played tricks on my eyes. I shined the light around, careful not to make a sound. A few feet away, I noticed a set of footprints in the soft soil, not from any animal I recognized. They were booted prints, large and heavy, leading away from the creek and back into the woods. My stomach sank. I wasn't alone. I went back into the tent, trying to steady my nerves. I turned over my supplies, thinking about what to do. The logical choice was to wait until first light and leave the area. but the thought of someone or something returning during the night kept me on edge. I decided to sit by the dying embers of my fire, keeping it alive with small sticks, so I could see better if anything approached. I kept my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, every nerve alert. Hours passed slowly. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, a snapping twig, even the distant howl of a coyote, made me flinch. I tried to remind myself that most of these noises were natural, that the forest itself was full of life, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced with possibilities, some rational, some irrational, each one gnawing at me. Couldn't sleep. My body ached, and exhaustion pressed against me, but I forced myself to stay awake, fearing what might happen if I let my guard down. At dawn, I saw the first pale light filtering through the trees. I took the chance to leave the tent cautiously, scanning the area with my flashlight even though it was getting brighter. The footprints were still there, fresh in the mud beside the creek. They led deeper into the forest. I felt my pulse quicken. Whoever had been here was close by, and the thought that they might still be nearby made my skin crawl. I packed my gear quickly but quietly, careful not to make any noise that might draw attention. Every step I took back toward the trail was deliberate and slow. I stayed off the main paths, sticking to areas with thick undergrowth where I could hide if necessary. Hours passed as I retraced my route. My legs were stiff and sore, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, but I pushed on, knowing that moving through the forest cautiously was my best chance. I kept thinking about what might have happened if I had confronted whoever or whatever it was outside my tent. The thought made me shiver. I realized that, despite my planning and experience, the forest was unpredictable, and human danger was even more unpredictable than the wilderness itself. By late morning, I finally reached a small dirt road I had marked on my map. Relief washed over me when I saw the road, a straight line through the chaos of the forest. I followed it, hoping to find a ranger station or any sign of civilization. The relief was immense, but I remained vigilant. I kept scanning the trees, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone following me. I felt like a hunted animal, though I knew the fear was a mix of instinct and memory of the night before. After several miles, I reached a park ranger station. I was exhausted, covered in sweat and dirt, but safe. I reported what had happened, showing the footprints and explaining my experience. The ranger listened and nodded, taking notes, and he mentioned that the area had seen trespassers and occasional criminal activity, including theft and assaults on hikers. That confirmed my fears. The sounds I had heard weren't animals. I realized that the wilderness was not only home to nature, but also to people who used its isolation to act without witnesses. I stayed at the ranger station for the night, recovering from the ordeal. I couldn't stop thinking about the camping trip, the beauty of the forest, the thrill of being alone, but also the danger I hadn't anticipated. I realized that preparation for nature is one thing, but preparation for human threats is entirely different. I promised myself that I would never underestimate the potential danger, even in remote wilderness areas. The next day, I left the forest completely, taking the main roads back to my town. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. The trip had been meant as a peaceful escape, but it had turned into a lesson in caution and awareness. I learned that no matter how prepared you are, the unknown is always present, and the forest, while beautiful, could be unforgiving. I returned home, tired but grateful to be safe, and I made a new plan for future camping trips. One that included awareness of other humans, not just wildlife, as part of survival. I had planned this solo camping trip for months. I had grown tired of crowded parks, crowded trails, and the constant noise of city life. I wanted complete solitude, the kind of isolation that left you completely alone with your thoughts, with nothing but the woods around you and the rhythm of your own breathing. I chose a remote area deep in the northern mountains, a place that was barely marked on any map and had little to no cell service. From everything I could gather, this was a place where people came to disappear for a few days, to test themselves, to get lost in the wilderness and find themselves again. That was the romantic idea anyway, the one I carried in my mind as I drove for hours along winding roads until the asphalt ended and the dirt track began. My car bounced over potholes and rocks, the headlights cutting through the darkness that seemed to press down on me like a living thing. By the time I reached the small clearing where I intended to set up camp, it was already late afternoon. The sun was low, streaking the sky in shades of gold and orange, but the temperature had already started to drop. I parked my car at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by dense pine and oak trees. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. I grabbed my pack and my tent, which was the only thing separating me from complete exposure to the elements. Setting up camp alone in the fading light is always a little more stressful than when someone else is there to help, but I prided myself on being self-sufficient. I found a level patch of ground, cleared away twigs and rocks, and set up my small green tent. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, unrolled my camping mat, and placed my backpack against the wall of the tent. Once that was done, I turned to collecting firewood. I knew that by nightfall, temperatures could drop sharply, and I wanted to have a fire ready not only for warmth but also for safety. The woods were quiet in a way that made your ears ache with anticipation. Every step I took on the dry leaves and broken twigs seemed to echo unnaturally loud, as if the forest was amplifying my presence. I gathered dry branches, small logs, and twigs, stacking them carefully near my fire pit. The sun sank lower, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the forest floor. I struck a few matches, finally coaxing flames to life in the pit. The fire hissed as it caught the damp underbrush, and I watched the orange flames dance and twist. The forest beyond the fire seemed to recede into darkness, the trees becoming solid black shapes against the dimming sky. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice, heating it over the fire while the smell of smoke mixed with the earthy scent of the forest. As I ate, I listened closely. The forest was never silent, but tonight the sounds were subtle, distant. A faint rustle in the trees, the occasional snap of a branch under an unseen animal's foot, and the whisper of wind through the pines. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, but still, the sense of being watched crept over me. After the meal, I cleaned my small cooking area, putting away utensils and securing my food in a bear-proof container. Then I sat by the fire, wrapped in a jacket against the cold, and watched the flames, letting my thoughts drift. Night fell faster than I expected, and soon the only light was the glow of my small fire and the faint shimmer of stars between the gaps in the treetops. That's when the first real sense of unease set in. I thought I heard footsteps, soft, distant, almost imperceptible, coming from the perimeter of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer or a raccoon, but the sound had a deliberate rhythm, heavier than a small animal, slower than a bird hopping from branch to branch. My heart rate increased, and I squinted into the darkness, trying to catch a movement. I told myself it was nothing. This was a remote area. Maybe a ranger, maybe another camper. Still, a seed of doubt was planted in my mind. I decided to ignore it and went into my tent to try to sleep. I lay down, zipped up my bag, and closed my eyes, but the sounds didn't stop. They got closer. I could hear snapping twigs, the crunch of leaves, slow and measured, like someone was circling the clearing. I tried to rationalize it. The uneven terrain, my imagination, maybe a fox or a coyote. But deep down, I knew this was different. The rhythm of the steps was too deliberate, too purposeful. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as the sound moved around the perimeter, always just out of sight. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. In situations like this, time stretches and distorts. The fire had burned low, leaving behind glowing embers that cast long shadows. I finally reached a decision. I couldn't just lie there waiting for whatever was out there to approach closer. I needed to be proactive. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, stepping out of the tent slowly. The cool night air hit me like a shock. The forest was black, the trees looming above me, and my fire was reduced to glowing coals. I scanned the darkness with the flashlight, its beams slicing through the black like a sword. I saw nothing. I called out, just a small, cautious noise, enough to make my presence known. Nothing. No reply, no rustle, no movement. The steps had stopped. I returned to the tent, my heart still pounding. I kept the flashlight on the side, just in case, and waited. Then I heard it again, a soft scraping, almost like something dragging across the leaves. I froze. My mind raced. This was not an animal. Animals don't drag things with that rhythm, with that weight. I considered leaving immediately, but the thought of navigating this dense forest in pitch black, with only a flashlight and no knowledge of the terrain, was terrifying in its own right. I stayed put, trying to quiet my thoughts, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then I noticed something. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Not all of it, just a few logs shifted, one or two pieces lying farther from the pile than I had placed them. Someone or something had been there. I felt the blood drain from my face. I moved to the edge of the clearing, shining the flashlight into the forest. The beam caught movement. Just for a second, a silhouette slipped between the trees. Human, definitely human, not an animal. My mind raced. How did someone get here without me noticing? How long had they been watching me? The implications were horrifying. I had no way to call for help. My phone had no signal. My car was a few hundred meters away, and even if I ran to it, I didn't know if this person was still in the forest. I retreated back to the tent and decided I couldn't just sit there. I packed up everything, leaving the fire to die, and moved silently through the shadows toward my car. The forest seemed alive with every noise magnified. The crack of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot, the rustle of leaves like someone breathing right behind me. I kept my flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other, and moved as quietly as possible. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I reached my car. My relief was instant, but it was also short-lived. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. My heart sank. I had left it locked. Whoever had been in the clearing had approached my car. I froze, scanning the darkness, looking for movement. Nothing. Then I remembered the knife. I gripped it tightly, raised it, and slowly, cautiously, opened the door fully. It was empty. Nothing inside the car. I checked the back seat, the trunk, everything, and found nothing. Someone had been close enough to touch my car, but they had left. Maybe they were watching me from the darkness now. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the black, and I didn't wait a second longer. I drove. I didn't follow the roads carefully. I just drove, sometimes down ruts, sometimes scraping against trees, the engine growling. But it didn't matter. I was getting out of that forest as fast as I could. I drove until I found a road with signs of civilization, until I saw a gas station, until I could call the police. They came, they searched the area, but they never found anyone. My campsite was empty. The forest had swallowed whoever had been there. I never went back. I never camped alone in a remote area again. And I never forgot the feeling of being watched, of someone moving just outside the edge of the light, knowing exactly where you were while you could see nothing of them. Changed me. It taught me that the woods, beautiful and peaceful by day, can become terrifyingly alive at night, not with ghosts or monsters, but with people who have the patience to wait, to watch, and to move silently in the darkness, unseen and unstoppable.